So the panel's all about just writing for the future and also getting the word out there, and that includes getting published. So it's really an open panel. I think a lot of the topics have been discussed, all relating to that theme. So I think it's really up to the panelists to decide where this goes. But I mean, we all want to get out there and get our message known. How do we do that? What methods do we need to take? I mean, do we need to write a book? Do we contribute to a blog post? Do we just proofwrite some interesting papers? What do we need to do to get the message that we want to have heard out there?
Can I start with something controversial, or maybe still?
Please do.
So I have publishing contracts for 4 books, counting my first one, and 3 that are about to come out. And all of those combined will probably reach fewer people than one article that I posted a month ago. I posted an article on Arctic sea ice, I posted it to Siam, and then George Jaworski helped me get it on to IO9. That probably had 100,000 views across the web. And the odds that all of my books combined will reach 100,000 readers is, you know, aspirational. Yeah, I'm really hoping here. I think I've got a shot. But it's an interesting thing that I was thinking about this. My talk tomorrow is about how to change the world with words. And in terms of the number of people you reach, it seems to me that in this day and age, the short form and online, if you don't necessarily get a lot of money for, or any money for in some cases, has a much bigger impact on people, just by dint of numbers, than any traditional long form writing.
I mean, I think that that's true if what you're measuring success as is how many people clicked on your article, which is not necessarily the most effective way to get your message out. I agree, it's super exciting when like 100,000 people look at something you've written, but again, it comes back to what I was saying before about your audience. Because if what you want to do is something like help people build more sustainable cities, like you really say you're a person who wants to make sure that next time New York is hit by a horrible hurricane, that there are wetlands areas that have been built around the city to prevent the city from flooding in such a destructive way so that people, you know, aren't like living on the street and seeing their homes devastated. Well, if you want to do that, just writing a blog post that gets 100,000 views from human beings on the internet is not going to help. What you need to do is be reaching, again, policymakers, urban planners, people in your local city government. So that kind of writing, which no one may ever even see, like if you write a white paper that you send to the New York City, you know, Planning Commission that helps them build those wetlands, well, you know, you've done something incredibly effective with your writing. And the same thing goes for things like people who do scenario building for government agencies who are like saying, all right, if you do this, we're going to end up in a war, so don't do this scenario, please, NSA, or whatever 3-letter agency you're dealing with. So I think you really have to aim, you have to figure out what are you trying to do, like with your, what do you want to change? Do you want to change the structure of your city? Do you want to inspire people to feel more excited about the future? Those are 2 really different things. And so you may have a small audience for one thing, but actually has a profound, profound impact. So don't denigrate the small audience.
We've really struggled with that at the IET, that you know, we've noticed with our own analytics that the articles that get the most hits most reliably, the ones that have Harry Potter, sex, you know, things like that.
Hopefully together.
Hopefully together, those are great. But they're not really a part of our core mission, which are, you know, catastrophic risks and human rights and things like that. So we've really gone back and forth. On the one hand, you want a lot of eyeballs going through the site, so it's not bad to have, you know, some sex and some Harry Potter in there every once in a while. But on the other hand, you want to have the substance. But I think, you know, more importantly, one of the things that we've tried to do is to try to engage with futurists to connect their topics to the contemporary concerns, and to not just have, you know, we often, you know, George has sometimes written things for us about the Fermi paradox or galactic evolution or something like that, which doesn't really connect very clearly to contemporary concerns. But in general, you know, a lot of our writers will be able to connect to those concerns. And on the other side, people who come from the academic community to write as popular and public intellectuals. And that's, I think that's the bigger challenge, is that folks who've gone through the ringer of graduate education in the United States become incomprehensible to the ordinary person, and to try to get them to really write something that's readable is the real challenge.
I think one thing we often leave out when we talk about writing is poetry, and the basic certain like soft moments in life, you know, just single words. What?
I if you should be passing the microphone. That's it.
Okay, microphone. Poetry.
Oh, that's a good idea. When we talk about writing, we often think about journalism or publishing a book or blogs or how to reach as many people as possible or how many hits we're getting and who is copying it on Facebook and promoting us. It seems to be that writing has become so much about self-promotion. I'm not saying that as a negative thing, but it's our calling card. We don't need to carry business cards anymore as long as we have our latest, what we've written about on Facebook or on a blog or whatever. But I find that there's this missingness of the poetry, a certain sensibility and just those moments in life where you can kick back and have a thought about something. And even in writing in narratives of entertainment and stories is just as influential as any great academic paper I've ever written. Not that any have been great, but the ones that have been successful will never be as successful as a great Harry Potter story or Pride and Prejudice or any of Jane Austen's writing. And to me, that is so necessary to remember and to consider.
I had a question.
Well, I was going to comment on the point about scientists trying to reach out to a more public audience in academic scientists, and it's not something that's rewarded or actually valued at all. In fact, you know, if you write a blog or something for the public, you know, a lot of people aren't open about it, basically, because it's seen as a waste of time.
Well, there is something called citizen scientist, and that's become quite popular, and where it's, you know, taking science into the hands of individuals who want to learn about science themselves and practice science on amateurish levels, to be sure, but ones that are consequential and have meaning to them. So the citizen scientist is a subculture that has grown.
I wanted to address what you were saying, though, about the fact that so many scientists are discouraged from speaking to the public, because it's a huge, I mean, as a science journalist, like, it becomes a problem for me because I want to interview people and they can't go on the record, really, because they face censure. And I think this is just it's really a horrible tragedy that scientists are being discouraged from speaking to the public, but also I think the other way around, like, people like us, like, I really feel like one of our goals as futurists should be to try to speak to scientists about what their larger goals are in terms of affecting the future of humanity and the future of the planet. And it's something that scientists are discouraged from thinking about, especially if you're in a very, you know, generally you're working in a very narrow area and you're doing things with like a laser and some optics, and you're not thinking, like, you're not able to think, like, how is this going to affect a much bigger, you know, swath of history? And so I guess, maybe I'm just complaining, but I really feel like we need to get over that culturally. We need to be thinking more about, as futurists, addressing scientists and thinking of ways to sneak scientists out of the lab a little bit to talk to us too. And it really does have to be a cultural change in academia, as well as in terms of what we think of as our audience. Because if we think, all right, our goal is 1 million clicks, then, I mean, maybe our goal should be 10 awesome scientists.
Right.
You know, I mean, maybe 10 of those million will be awesome scientists, let's hope, but, yeah.
Or maybe maybe you could write like news pieces in Nature so that scientists can read them.
Yeah.
Have you ever done something like that?
So she's suggesting, like, why not have futurists writing for Nature and things like that. There are science journalists who write for Nature. I haven't personally written for Nature, but I've written for places like Technology Review and things like that scientists read. And I think actually quite a number of scientists read places like New Scientist and Wired, like, even though they might not admit it, like, it's not going to be on the top of their stack.
We IO9 too.
Yeah, because every time a scientist tells me they read IO9, I'm like, I am happy today. That's my goal. But yeah, I think that there needs to be more of that. And occasionally nature will sort of do something incredibly dumb, like publish a piece of science fiction that's really, really bad. And maybe some of you know about what I'm talking about. But yeah, so I think that is definitely what we need to be doing, like more of that, like more of public intellectuals writing for places like Nature and Science and things like PLOS, and then more scientists writing for IO9 or writing for, you know, Extra when it existed and things like that. So.
Question?
We talk a lot about traditional types of writing and publishing and scientific collaborations and how we spread ideas. I have 3 children of various ages, and I realize and accept and actually embrace the fact very proactively that the way they are today absorbing most effectively the advanced transhumanist ideas that will form the basis of the world they are going to live in come from transmedia experiences, from video games that are becoming more and more advanced, of cross-media where a book becomes a movie, becomes a video game, becomes a augmented reality game, etc. And you know, I don't know whether you're familiar with Deus Ex or others. And so I would like to hear what is your feeling about this and the opportunity of interacting and influencing the direction where these expressions are going.
I'll take a stab at it, and I'll hand it over to whoever wants to talk about it. So I have 2 nonfiction books and 2 fiction books. Only 1 book is out, but that's what's in the pipe right now. And I have an experience that no one has ever told me that they were up till 3 a.m. reading a piece of nonfiction, by the way. But they have told me about fiction, right? It emotionally engages. And all the transmedia experiences that you just talked about were fiction. They were a story. And so I think that's not an accident. In fact, somewhat related to this, was a paper that came out just in the last month that looked at the ability of fiction and nonfiction to change attitudes on the same topic, and found that fiction, or narrative anyway, was much more effective at changing attitudes. They looked specifically at race relations, but also positing relations or attitudes towards people of other sexual orientations, and finding that depictions in fiction were incredibly more powerful than any other effect, including any amount of nonfiction you could read, in changing attitudes. So I think that's the way that you're talking about your kids absorbing these ideas, all of them through stories, I think are how most people are going to absorb these ideas.
But what we're leaving out of this conversation is that it's visual. You're reading words that are visual, so it's not just the words and sentence structures forming paragraphs, forming chapters, that you're taken on a visual journey, and I think that's what keeps you up to 3 in the morning, because words create images, and perhaps some of the scientific papers that don't keep you up to 3 in the morning are because they're factual and you get tired at that time at night. But I've worked with scientists for years. In the arts and sciences, that's what we do. It's not a hidden culture. It's very accessible, and in transhumanism, there's many scientists. In fact, there's probably more scientists than definitely more than designers like myself. And I think it's mostly scientists over philosophers and sociologists and the political force or designers.
I just have to say, on the flight out here from Connecticut, I watched The Born Supremacy, which is about a guy, you know, it's the 4th, I guess, in the series of movies, but the guy has been subject to at least 1 gene experiment, and then a set of pharmaceutical experiments. The gene experiment for physiological enhancement, and the pharmaceuticals are for his cognitive enhancement, and then he has to go to the Philippines, and he's helped by the heroin to get the gene enhancement for the cognitive side, so that he can be stable as an enhanced human being. And he's the hero. You know? So I thought that was kind of incredible, and you know, not since like Dark Angel, or you know, there are a couple of those kinds of unabashed positive depictions of genetic enhancement like that. But a lot more people are going to see that than read any of our articles.
Yeah, Limitless, I think, was another one, which
Limitless.
apparently, I haven't read the original story, it was a lot more negative, I understand, but in the movie, essentially, by pushing through the horrible experiences, he ends up being just fine in the end, and that's a very unusual message for a movie.
Yeah, that was incredible. That was one of the that was one story that actually had a positive outcome. And even that, like, Limitless was great, not like Memento, but Limitless was really great. Another one, Vanilla Sky. You know, here's another one, out of the blue. It was a hard story to follow unless you really understood chronics and what was not said, but at least there was hope at the end of it. And I thought that was very revealing about looking at the mind and the transformative aspect of these narratives.
This is one of the things I've struggled with, because we had at the IAT a culture sub-project for years, and I guess when we first put it together, the kind of vision was, well, let's get out there and fight those bioconservative memes and have more Limitless and less of the other kind of stuff. And as it's evolved over the years, I think we've begun to realize that, or I've begun to realize, and those involved in the IAT, that we don't really just want positive visions of enhancement. We want complex visions of the future in which bad stuff, and this goes back to the kind of cyberpunk ethos, you know, it's just, you don't just want the all shiny vision of a utopian future. You want a really complex vision where, like the Bruce Sterling's Schismatrix, you know, the early adopters of anti-aging therapies, their skin falls off and stuff like that. You know, stuff goes wrong. And that is as important for us to have as a part of our future as the shiny stuff.
Question?
Yes.
Speak up, please.
From your perspectives as futurists, are any connections being made to the scientific community with the goal of building relationships so that you'll be able to pass them pieces of information that you think are important, that will be useful to them? That's the same question for policymakers. They always want things, not a lot, but they want things to help explain what you're doing. Are those type of efforts underway?
I think that those efforts are underway a lot more in the realm of policymaking. There's pretty much, I think for a long time, there's been a tradition of scenario building, particularly among the intelligence community and the armed forces, where, I mean, that's part of what they have to do is think about what the outcome will be, because it's obviously quite, lives are at stake. And there are places now where, you know, there are graduate level programs for training futurists to do things like that, and to work with governments. In Canada, I know that this is fairly common, that futurists will work with the governments or government agencies to build like a 10-year plan or a 20-year plan, looking at anything from a military scenario to, since this is Canada, things like, you know, land use scenarios and things like that, resource allocation. In terms of scientists, I think there's less, because the thing is like, scientists think that we're kind of just spouting off. You know, like, okay, fine, you guys, you don't have a degree in science, and you're trying to tell me where my scientific field is going to go. And I've definitely, like I've just finished a book that's coming out next year, and in the course of doing it, I was talking about the far future and speculating about how humans would enhance themselves and would re-engineer themselves to go to space. And so I went to talk to a synthetic biologist at Berkeley, and he was just like, what? No. He was like, people are never going to want to modify their germline. Are you kidding? He was like, if you could even do, this is the guy who works as a synthetic biologist in a lab, right? So he can't, part of it is, he can't take a position where he's saying, well, actually, my goal is to modify humanity, because he'll never be able to keep his job. He'll never be able to get grants, because it's a very unpopular idea. So he's working on, you know, modifying like bacteria. He works on single-celled organisms. He keeps it modest, because you can't, if you're in science, you can't make these crazy, awesome, grandiose claims that we're making up here about the singularity or whatever, because you're just not going to survive in a research environment. Plus, you can't do it overnight, right? You can't be like, I worked on a single-celled organism and now I'm modifying myself to survive in space. So I think, you know, that would be nice. But so I think I think we need to work on that. I think it's not an unsolvable problem, but I think we need to speak more of the language of scientists, be a little bit more cautious in our future scenario predicting. And now I'm going to hand this over to you.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. It's amazing how conservative science is in that respect. People like Ian Wilmot, who cloned a sheep, but asked about human cloning. Oh my goodness, of course not! That's vastly different. Close to home to me is the attitude of the Society for Cryobiology, where if you talk about actually using what they're doing to save human lives by cryopreserving whole people, oh no, we're going to throw you out of the society if you try and do that. So there's huge pressure in many of those fields not to have broad visions or future visions, but to stay very narrowly focused and respectable. That's very hard to overcome.
So I will add an optimistic note that I do think there's a couple exceptions. So I think organizationally NASA's an exception. I mean, they had their 100-year Starship conference where people like David Brin and Greg Baer were there, along with theologians and all sorts of people talking about this. And then I think in biology, which a lot of us focus on, the more eminent someone is, I think the more willing they are to talk out. So like Craig Venter, I don't think he would use the word transhumanist, but he effectively is one. If you talk to the guy in private, he wants to live forever. He's more optimistic about it than we are, potentially, than Annalee is.
James Watson.
And James Watson, and sometimes also with James Watson, for instance, when somebody writes down their thoughts and writes a book, you may not like everything they have to say, actually. And then George Church, who's arguably the second most eminent biologist alive right now, or certainly in the top 10. And he has a book out with Ed Hughes that just came out. I haven't read it yet, but my understanding is that it's a fairly blatantly transhumanist book where he talks about the far future. But Stephen Hawking actually talking about we shouldn't do SETI because aliens might come in. At least he's thinking big thoughts. May not agree with him. So the people who don't have to worry about their funding are willing to reveal thoughts in their heads that maybe a lot of scientists do have, but who are worried about losing their grants.
2 points. DARPA always reaches out to futurists. I worked for IBM, which worked for DARPA, I think it's 6 years ago, developing scenarios on non-invasive human enhancement. So I had to look at the latest science and technology of where the direction of it, and anything it couldn't be invasive. That was the line there. It had to be something that could be taken out, like an appendage, an application, an enhancement, like a wearable. And if it was somewhat invasive biologically, it had to be able to come out, so it wouldn't alter the individual. So DARPA has always been very interested, and so is IBM. So it's interesting that they are looking at it, but they're looking long term. And the question is why military? Of course, because they want the military to protect the soldiers against injury, and good for them for doing that. The other point I wanted to make is had to do with I forgot something. I'm having a senior moment. No, wait.
Well, I forget what point I was going to make, but I was recently at another military-funded scenario.
Oh, I just remembered.
Okay.
And then I'll remind my second senior citizen. Okay. Yeah. The other point I want to make is going back to space exploration. I mean, I think space is great. There is a transhumanist session. A track at the International Space Association. We have in Washington, D.C. David Orban spoke at it last year. I wasn't able to make it, but I'll be at the one in San Diego. So it's interesting that transhumanism is a track at some of these space organizations, and there's space tourism that is very interested in transhumanism as well. Space Tourism Society has been supporting transhumanism for 20 years. Okay. Now, you want me to remind you?
No, I got it. Just the difficulties of bringing together the communities again. I was reminded of because I was at a DoD-funded event in DC, and the theme of the day with there's like 50 generals or something. I don't know what they were, lieutenants. They had uniforms on, and it was all kind of weird because I hadn't been in that kind of a crowd before. But the theme of the day was what's going to be a game changer for the defense environment, and they had all these lists of possible things, and there were things like a 50% breakthrough in battery technology. And it's like, really? That's the only game changer you can think of? It's like, not zombie nanoweapons. So, I mean, it's hard sometimes when you really bring together our kind of speculation and futurism. Another example was that 5 years ago at Oxford, Nick Bostrom had brought together an international conference to launch his book, Global Catastrophic Risks. So we spent the weekend talking about asteroid detection and how to blow them up, and nuclear weapons and nano risks, and whether we were living in a simulation and might piss off the simulators and be suddenly turned off and things like that. And then we met with resilience.gov.uk, which was the disaster planners for the British government. And they showed us a chart of all the things that they were thinking about. Big floods, major storms, rising sea levels, and things like that. We said, well, where's asteroids? And they said, what? So we were just talking completely past each other.
Before the question, I'm just curious, how many people up here have done futurist consulting for some form of military or intelligence agency? You're the only one who is clean.
Hardly a pacifist either. Where's the, come on, read the contract.
I just think it's interesting that the military, they bring in weirdos like us to talk to them.
Take a look back at von Forster at the Illinois University and the first brain-computer integration lab. Okay, that's going way back to the late 1960s, after the Macy conferences, say 1950s, 60s, and then it diminished in, I think, 1970 because they ran out of money. But they got their funding for brain-computer interfaces from the U.S. government. So it's interesting that it has such a history there.
Okay, so there's a question.
Yeah. So on that point, further, how do you think transhumanism should aim to interact with government? Are we talking probably for candidates, or outreach, or behind-the-scenes outreach to DARPA, or ignore it and hope it doesn't bully you, or what should we use?
Let me take a first crack at it. I think part of the problem is a definition of what transhumanism is, and it will differ for many of us. I think some of us, like when you were saying we want to have a transhumanist resource that shows that anybody can have any religious view. Not all transhumanists agree with that. Some transhumanists would include secularism, separation of church and state, that whole agenda as a part of our mission, and others would not. So the lowest common denominator is that we believe that people have a right to that we have a right to human enhancement technologies to control our own brains, bodies, and reproduction. And that almost all of us agree on. And so starting from that point, you can have a PAC, I don't think you could have a political party. You could have a special interest group that supported candidates and people that did those kinds of things. But as soon as you get beyond that very, very core set of issues, we go all over the place. I mean, in the Soviet Union, there are Putinists who are transhumanists, and then there are anti-Putinists. And in Italy, we have two transhumanist organizations, both of which consider the other the fascist transhumanist organization. And around the world, we have folks who think that the state should be abolished, and others, like myself, who think that the FDA absolutely has a role, and the National Health Service absolutely has a role. And so where do you go as a political force when you have that kind of disagreement?
But I think that's good. I think that it's not everyone thinks alike. The bottom line with transhumanism, it's about life extension. I mean, you have to. I mean, I'm not a reductionist, but if you look at what is
we all agree on that.
Yeah, and then what have your own life. It's none of my business what you do. As long as it doesn't affect or diminish that tenet. And so I'm a very strong believer in having a certain principle and a value system of a particular view that prefaces that we're based on that. What do you think, Max? Doesn't get much of a chance to talk.
Well, in terms of influencing governments, I think Annalee, you said about position papers, those can be very influential. I think there's one that came out recently, which hopefully people in the National Institutes on Aging will read, about the effects of extending healthy human lifespan, how it will affect the economy, how it will affect social security and retirement. Because politicians reflexively think, oh, that'd be a bad thing if we live longer because it would increase the senior burden. But exactly the opposite is true if you're actually increasing healthy lifespan. And having a really powerful analysis, which just a few people read, I think that could be tremendously influential. Maybe we can also do a novel version of it, a novelization of that to give them the emotional impact too. But so I think that's kind of, it's not so rewarding in the sense of getting a lot of attention, but that's I think really very influential. One of the more influential forms of writing.
I just want to make the point that anybody who wants to eat or get something to drink, the kitchen is closing soon. So please wander over casually while the panel is still going and get something to eat or drink. So it may be closed in about 10 minutes. Okay.
Just to finish off, I think you may have to divide your writing approach depending on whether you want to influence the public, who will then pressure governments perhaps on particular issues, versus how you'd approach governments themselves. Talking to actual officials and bureaucrats, you probably want to be very, very moderate and try to speak their language and be pretty conservative, even while you have the bigger picture in mind. Whereas to the public, you might want to get them a little more excited about the long-term possibilities and be a bit more visionary. So really decide who is your audience and how is it best to approach them. And don't try and approach them all in the same way at the same time.
I wanted to get your opinions about getting scientists and theorists and writers together at conferences or such, face to face, so that they can actually really have a conversation in real time about these sorts of things. And yeah.
I vote yes.
Sure. I mean, I think it happens a lot more than we think already. Informal contacts and all of that. Can I address that question over there? Actually, can I just add one little thought, which is that I think that there's a legitimate view for people who are here thinking a little bit out ahead and doing some kind of pre-surveying of the ground and laying some tracks on the ethical issues that haven't hit us yet. But I think there's another force which is way more powerful, which is that consumers are incredibly transhumanist. When it comes right down to it, most consumers, when offered the choice of something that makes them live longer, be smarter, be healthier, better looking, whatever, they want it. So they pressure governments in the short term in a pro-technology adoption way and pressure the market in a pro-technology way more than we ever can. What we can do is really kind of be 5 minutes or 5 years or whatever ahead and thinking through some of the quandaries that might result in.
I just want to amplify that because I was going to say, when you ask that question, I mean, we need many, many kinds of writing and many kinds of advocacy. For example, if you look back at, in US history, we had slavery just, about 150 years ago. And one of the things that really changed people's minds about slavery was a novel called Uncle Tom's Cabin, which now, if you read it, is horribly racist, but at the time, it was quite progressive, and it was simply because it allowed white people, to empathize with black people and to see what their lives were like, even though it may not have been very realistic. At least it created empathy. And I think that kind of writing, alongside all of the advocacy that was being done politically to prevent people from being enslaved, worked together. And so you can never have one without the other. You always have to have the crazy fictional version, and then you have to have the very serious-minded, what's going to happen in the next 3 months version. You can't separate them.
Just a very quick point, which I guess is probably a pretty obvious one, but I'll say it anyway because nobody has yet. Don't worry too much about what's the most effective kind of writing you can do. Do what you love to do. Exactly. Because what you feel passionate about is going to be more influential. If you say, oh my goodness, I'm really a fiction writer, but I have to write a really boring position paper for a government agency, you're not going to do it. So do what you love and then try and tweak it a little bit.
Definitely.
Well, I just want to go back to his comment and say that the far left needs to be transhumanized, and we need to have Anonymous shut down DARPA as much as possible. We need protesters outside of the DARPA building trying to shut it down. And I think DARPA has one of the worst track records of any organization in the history of this world. And so, yeah. So I think
but DARPA created the internet. DARPA's working right now on creating ethics programmed into robots. They're like working on human enhancement. Like, I agree, I'm not like into like killing babies and stuff, but like, DARPA's not the biggest problem.
They also worked on but they worked on like, like gas to make, enemies homosexual and stuff. I
know, we're in favor of that.
That's how awesome that would have been.
They're responsible for... Let's hear a response.
Yeah.
I mean, I think it's an interesting question about the relationship to the military. Let's focus on that specifically, because I'm often asked about super soldier research and things like that. And I think it's often a cover for people to be anxious about the applications of military force. As you said, how can you really argue that soldiers shouldn't have to die on the battlefield, that they could have some kind of super plasma that would keep them from dying of their wounds, or that they might get a better prosthetic limb out of the whole deal when their legs get blown off by a landmine or something. You can't really argue with most of the super soldier research. What you can argue with is the application of drones going to make it more likely for the US to blow up civilians or not? Or to engage across border conflicts or not? And do we think that that's a good idea or not? The number of people who died in the Civil War compared to the number of people who died in World War II, compared to the number of people who died in Vietnam, compared to the number of people who died in Iraq, it's gone down, down, down because of the improvements in military technology. Yes, exactly. And that is a good thing. It also makes it easier in some ways for us to project American force into other countries, and that may not be a good thing. Those are two entirely separate questions.
Right.
If you're interested in kind of futurism and war, there's a book called War and Anti-War by Alvin and Heidi Toffler. That it's maybe 20 years old, but it was very influential to me when I read it. It was a very different view of the military in a lot of ways. And before Pinker was talking about all this and so on, they were talking about the urge towards less lethal weapons or more pinpoint lethal weapons for a lot of reasons. The military wants that, and while it does have these civil rights issues, less people are dying.
Yeah, I mean, I would remind folks that one of the interesting thought experiments in Star Trek, especially Next Generation, is the idea that basically the military has evolved into the Federation. I mean, they have the same kind of military titles, but they are now an organization devoted to peace and exploration. And it's an interesting thought experiment because it's a very aspirational idea of where the military could evolve. We see little specks of that happening now in the military. I mean, the military has a very honorable occupation, which is to defend against danger and protect. And when it's perverted into like I said, baby killing and horrible fighting conflicts that shouldn't become violent conflicts, that's a dark future. But there is also this very aspirational side to it that I think we forget about because so many bad things happen in the name of defense, and that they're not really good defensive things.
If you're interested in drone strikes, for instance, which is something that I think has a lot of awfulness to it, maybe the best thing you can do is write a novel about that, from the perspective of somebody who's subject to that. Daniel Suarez has a book, Kill Decision, out. I think that, I haven't read it, I hear good things. I think there the notion is that the drones become autonomous, but of course you can write a pretty horrific novel where the drones are still controlled by some CIA employee in a bunker.
Or where Anonymous takes control of a drone. Yeah, that's gonna happen. Hack the drones, it's awesome.
The problem with the U.S. government and the U.S. military is that the U.S. military is not a defense military anymore. It's just still an imperialist military.
No, that's not true completely.
We're also cultural imperialists. Don't forget about that. Since we're all sitting here talking about writing and how awesome it is, think about how much writing has been used to fuck over the world, especially American pop culture. Yeah, there's some blood on its hands.
Okay, one last question. Anybody? We got one over here.
I want to go back to slightly less controversial topic from a few minutes ago about working with scientists and talking to or writing to scientists. I work with physicians every day, and in fact I just read George Church's book, and he was talking with a physician who's very interested in genetics. I've been working with him for a couple of years on that score. And trying to mention some of the more far-out ideas that Church has, like mirror humans and turning an elephant into a woolly mammoth. And I just got this instant kind of, nah, not possible. Let's go do some real work. And I realized sort of two barriers here that I think deserve discussion, or maybe just thought. One is that working scientists, they plod through really basic stuff every day. And so getting tiny little changes done seems really hard. So to tell them, your tiny little change that took 3 years, well, that's great, but we're going to have something happen in 5 minutes that's 1,000 times farther. They can't see that. The other is just the bureaucracy in science. not as a deprecatory thing, but just there's a lot of hurdles. You have to go through committees. You have to work with all sorts of layers of the hierarchy. So with that in mind, I'm wondering about ideas for speaking to scientists, working scientists.
All right, quickly.
Yeah, so I sympathize with that. My girlfriend got her PhD recently in tuberculosis, so she's a micro specialist. She knows everything there is to know about one specific pathway inside tuberculosis. And that's what she worked on for years, right? Scientists and physicians tend to be specialists. They focus on one thing. And I think one place where futurists are different is we're often generalists. And I think in many ways, the best way to reach scientists with our ideas is not through their work brain, but through their recreation brain.
I think you ask a very important question, but I would say that not all scientists are the same. We can't generalize the scientific field or scientists to all be narrow-minded, stuck in their laboratories, unaware of the rest of the world, not reading any of the cultural articles or magazines. That's really not true. There are a number of scientists who are very forward-thinking. Stephen Hawking, for example, Greg Fay, Michael West, Cynthia Kenyon. There's a lot of people working with C. elegans and looking at how they can extend the life. Look at Michael Rose and the fruit fly. So the scientists generally, yes, indeed, are sequestered to the laboratory, single tracking a particular experiment in their research to find, to reduce it to an issue that could be reproduced over and over again to find the truth and the value of it. However, there are scientists who are visionary and creative that are looking outside that particular necessary scope and are very inventive. So that's...
I just want to address one aspect of this, which is the notion that scientists have a responsibility to think about the future of their work. And I think that this is sometimes raised as a kind of self-regulatory issue, that if only scientists would be as responsible as Oppenheimer. But Oppenheimer didn't actually stop the bomb. He never sabotaged any work at on hydrogen weapons or anything like that. And I don't think it's the responsibility of scientists for that reason. I don't think it's that scientists have to think about whether working on a microorganism is going to result in the change of the human race, because they have to then decide whether they're going to work on a microorganism or not. But I just think they would contribute to the larger conversation that we all need to have. So I do think that they should be part of the conversation. But it's not. But I think the real responsibility is that we need to create the kinds of public, journalistic, and policy spaces where those questions get addressed and actual accountability gets called into play.
Okay, thanks. All right, I'd like to thank you all for coming. You may be able to still get a drink if you're quick. You may be able to quickly get something. I don't know. You have to go up and find out. But yeah, thanks everybody so much for coming, and the panelists for putting their energy in and participating here. Also Randall, who behind the scenes did a lot of work to help this get off the ground and introduce me to Borderlands. And Borderlands